This is the first video of P1, which is the first physics module that you'll study for your GCSEs. P1 is titled Energy for the Home, and in this module you're going to learn about thermal transfers and how heat is transferred from one place to another, the properties of light, which will lead us into discussing the electromagnetic spectrum, and then the last half of the module is going to focus about how the different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum can be used for communication, for cooking, for wireless technology, and then finally we'll discuss earthquake waves and UV radiation as it comes from the sun. The objectives for your first lesson will be this. We need to understand how heat transfers from one place to another. We need to be able to analyse and interpret thermograms, and we need to be able to discuss and evaluate the differences between heat and temperature. So we're actually going to start with one of our latter objectives. We're going to start with trying to understand the difference between temperature and heat. And to do that I want to try and think about two examples. So what we have here is a beaker of boiling water. And so the question is, if we compare that to, say, just a simple match, okay, which one has the higher temperature? Now, in reality, the match will have a significantly higher temperature than the boiling water, which is obviously 100 degrees C. The next question is then, well, which one has more energy? Now, I have about 300 centimetres cubed of water. So I have quite a lot of water. That means it's going to store loads of energy. In comparison, the match has a very small amount of energy. So there's clearly a difference between the temperature that an object can have and how much energy it stores. So the difference is this, that heat is a measure of energy. So when we use the word heat, we talk about energy, and therefore we measure heat in joules, which is the unit of energy. Temperature is a measure of how hot an object is compared to a scale. Now that scale can be arbitrary. It can just be one thing is hot compared to another. So for example, ice cubes are hot compared to liquid nitrogen, but ice cubes are cold compared to a Bunsen burner. It can also be on a scale that we can choose. So for example, degrees C or Celsius is the scale that is a result of comparing things to the boiling point and freezing point of water. The Kelvin scale is another important temperature scale because that is the absolute temperature scale and is what we compare everything against absolute zero to. Next we're going to try and investigate this difference between heat and temperature further. So we're going to do an investigation, and the investigation will look like this. You're going to have two boiling tubes, one with hot water in and one with ice water. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure the temperature change over time. Now we're going to set this situation up so that each of our two little systems has a hot boiling tube and a cold boiling tube. And what we're going to do is we're going to put their surroundings as one is going to be hot water and the other is going to be cold water. And we're going to measure the temperature change every 30 seconds and track what happens to the temperature of each of the boiling tubes. We're going to be able to use this to plot a graph, and that's going to help us identify where heat is travelling from and to. When you do this experiment, you'll be required to write a hypothesis. So you'll have to make a prediction about where you think the temperature is going to change the most, and therefore where the most heat is going to be transferred from and to. You're also going to have to analyse your results, okay, which is what we want to look at next. So stop the video at this point, do the lesson, and involve yourself in the practical as much as possible. Afterwards, once you've got your graph, come back and we'll have a look at interpreting what the results actually mean. Let's have a look at the graph that you should have got for this experiment. This is the graph of thermal transfer for the boiling tube with hot water in and with ice water. So the hot water is shown with the red crosses and the ice water is shown with the blue. Now, if you have a look at the axes, we have time along the bottom and we've measured the temperature as for each of the boiling tubes as time has gone on. So if we have a look at the line of best fit for the hot water first, we'll see that initially there is a very big temperature difference between the hot water and the regular normal water that was in the beaker. So because there is such a big difference, it very rapidly loses that heat to the water in the surroundings. Now this phenomenon is called a temperature gradient. And a temperature gradient is literally like, think of a slope. So if we have the graph here, the gradient is how steep the line is. So this graph is very steep at this point. So that means that the temperature is changing very, very quickly. And as time goes on, the gradient gets less and less and less. So the temperature change the amount starts to decrease with time. Ice water is much closer in temperature to sort of the regular water that we added. So the temperature change isn't as dramatic, and it very, very levels out. Now you can make predictions about what might happen to this graph if we left the experiment for even longer, about what might happen to the final temperature. But you can see very clearly from this a really important concept of the way that heat is transferred. Firstly, that heat always goes from hot to cold. So the heat energy was being transferred from the warm water into the regular water, which is why the temperature drops so much. That temperature in the warm water is then being transferred into the ice water, and that's causing the temperature of the ice water to increase. So heat is always transferred from hot to cold. The second important point is the bigger the temperature difference between the hotness and the coldness, the bigger the temperature gradient, and therefore the faster the rate at which energy is transferred. When you do this graph in your lessons, you should make sure that now that you understand the graph, you should annotate each part and explain clearly what it represents. So be able to describe how the gradient tells us there is a large temperature gradient and therefore a big energy transfer, and show the point about that hot energy is always transferred from hot to cold. The last part of this initial lesson on P1 is about thermograms. And thermograms are images that show us where infrared radiation is being emitted most from an object. So that gives us an indication as where there is the most heat being transferred. And so if we break the word down, thermo means heat and gram refers to a picture of. Now the temperature scale here indicates the temperatures that are hottest and are coldest. So white hot is considered to be the absolute hottest, and going to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet being cold, and then black finally being the absolute coldest. So it shows us a picture of how hot an object is. The different temperatures are represented by different colours, and we use an infrared camera to detect the infrared radiation being emitted. And that shows you the different colours representing different temperatures. The uses of thermograms you need to be able to recognise. So the main uses of thermograms is we can use them for security or for night vision. We can use them for medical imaging to spot hot spots in the body, not just for human beings, but also for other animals, which can then link that to scientific research. And we can also use it in engineering to spot faults in machinery. The last main use is we can use it for earth science, to survey the earth and identify, in this case, the fact that underneath this volcano there is a significant amount of movement due to lava, which obviously from the surface is not visible. So hopefully now we can tackle our objectives so that we should understand the first law of thermodynamics, which in simple terms is that energy can't be created or destroyed in terms of heat, and that heat must always go from hot to cold. Hopefully you can analyse and interpret thermograms and understand what the colours represent, and evaluate the difference between temperature and heat.